welcome to the April edition of The Coffee House, where in the next hour, taking poverty law to the next level, former Maryland Attorney General Steve Sachs joins forces with Baltimore's Public Justice Center. We'll explore a genetic link between body weight and genes with NIH's Marc Reitman. Fiddler and guitar picker Bruce Molsky share some old-timey tunes. Then join us for an off-season trip to Assateague and Chincoteague. Plus, Graceful Simplicity author Jerome Siegel on living better with less stuff. Can you believe it? Art and opera at the City Place Mall in Silver Spring. And the top 10 lists for book sales and video rentals in Tacoma Park.
Hi, and welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. Answer this true life question correctly, and you too may have a future as a high-powered, high-paid lawyer. In his 1911 will, U.S. Senator Bacon, that's really his name, a white man, leaves a plot of land in Macon, Georgia for use as a public park. He provides, though, that the park is exclusively for the pleasure of white people. The city of Macon is, for years, faithful to his wish, but it eventually concludes that segregation is unconstitutional, and it lets blacks in the park. Some of Senator Bacon's heirs argue that either the park stays lily white or it reverts to the senator's estate, that is, it belongs to them. Question 1. What do you think the Georgia Supreme Court ruled? Question 2. What do you think the U.S. Supreme Court, the liberal Warren Court, ruled? And question 3. Would you believe a similar issue is now before the highest court of Maryland? Well, it is. But with us are two lawyers who take the view that the Senator Bacon case is not, in the words of Al Gore, controlling legal authority in a case before the Maryland Court of Appeals. Deborah Eisenberg is managing attorney at the Public Justice Center's Appellate Advocacy Project. Steve Sachs is former Maryland Attorney General, former U.S. Attorney for Maryland, and a former partner at Wilmer, Cutler & Pickering. Welcome both of you to the Coffee House. Before we get to the Senator Bacon estate question, or its analog in Maryland, we'll keep people in suspense about that for a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the Public Justice Center's Appellate Advocacy Project. Deborah, what is it, why is it, and what's its mission?
Sure. The Public Justice Center is a nonprofit civil rights and anti-poverty organization. We've been around for 15 years now, and we do work in a variety of civil rights, housing, workers' rights areas. And we focus on something called impact litigation, where we try to solve problems that will impact an entire group, mostly on poverty issues. And what we saw was there was a big gap at the appellate court level. We were bringing great litigation in the trial courts of Maryland, but there needed to be a voice for the legal services organizations of Maryland, both at the Maryland appellate level and the federal appellate level.
Why not the legal services organizations themselves?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is simply the lack of resources, lack of staff, and our goal with the Appellate Advocacy Project was really to be there as a resource for legal services organizations and even for the private bar if they don't have the resources to take the case to the next level, or they just want technical assistance, or if they want an amicus friend of the court brief to be submitted in support of their case, they can come to us and we can use the support of other private law firms as well as ourselves to make the case more powerful in the appellate courts and to
so
give a better presentation.
So you both represent clients and present amicus briefs to the courts?
Absolutely.
Okay. And this is both state and federal courts?
Yes.
Maryland, along with Virginia, the Carolinas, West Virginia, did I say, is in the Fourth Circuit, which has a reputation as perhaps the most conservative federal appellate court in the country, kind of the Jesse Helms of the federal judiciary. I suppose that when you think about an appellate strategy, Steve Sachs, for the federal court system, that you really have to keep that in mind, that it's no longer going to be simply a question of a bad rule that you want to challenge perhaps at a district level, but there's a chance that this will be the law in 5 states if the Fourth Circuit rules against you.
Yeah, that's a problem. I take a little exception to equating the Fourth Circuit entirely with Jesse Helms. I mean, for two reasons. Number one, there are a number of judges on the Fourth Circuit whose views politically, ideologically are very much different than Senator Helms. And secondly, even the conservative judges, and clearly you're absolutely right, it is probably the most conservative court, federal appellate court in the country. There's hope even for them. That is to say, I think it's fair to say they judge the cases that come before them on their merits. They have a point of view, to be sure. One of the goals, one of the strategies that a group like the Public Justice Center has to consider is when not to take a case, when not to push an issue in a court that is likely to be inhospitable.
You're 66 years old. You recently retired from Wilmore, Cutler, and Pickering. You held the two most prestigious government lawyer jobs in the state of Maryland, both Attorney General and U.S. Attorney, and now you've joined up with the Public Justice Center. Is this a late in life conversion to public interest law, or is this consistent with your practice over the years?
I think it's largely consistent, Mark. It's while at Wilmer Cutler, we did an awful lot of pro bono work. Wilmer Cutler Pickering is very proud of its reputation as associating with groups like the Public Justice Center to do pro bono work. But you're right.
But you don't get a $500,000 partnership share by doing pro bono work exclusively.
There is no question that the profession of law is, the large law firms don't exist and don't survive doing pro bono work. That's absolutely right. I retired, as you say. I'm of counsel to the firm, which means I can kind of do what I please, which is a terrific delight. But I see this public interest work as very much a continuation of my public jobs in law enforcement, because when you are advocating the rights of tenants in housing projects who are being messed with, or kids who are suffering from lead paint poisoning, and on goes the list. When you're doing those things, you're really enforcing the law, much like the police enforce the law. And so I see this really as very much a part of the law enforcement background that I've had for much of my life.
Fair enough. Let's take our audience out of suspense now, Deborah, and let's tell them what happened in the Evans case, what we call the Senator Bacon case in Georgia, in both the Georgia Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, and then talk about the case that you have before the Maryland Court of Appeals.
Well, certainly. Well, the Georgia Supreme Court actually did what the heirs wanted. The Georgia Supreme Court said, well, if the Supreme Court says that we have to let black people into the park, well, then we obviously can't uphold the intent of the senator in his will, so the money must revert back to the heirs. It went up to the United States Supreme Court, and Justice Black basically affirmed that decision. And the reason was the court relied on the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, and you need state action in order to have a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, and they found that there was no state action here, simply allowing public trustees to be replaced with private trustees.
This was just a private transaction. The state wasn't involved, so the state can't override it.
Exactly. So that's what the Supreme Court held. And this was a case back in the 60s, I believe it was.
So what are you going to do about that?
Well, the judge, the rest of the story is that in the Maryland case, the lower court judge applying the Supreme Court precedent held effectively the same thing, that in this case the Keswick home would not get the funds, and the funds would go to an alternative beneficiary.
This was a situation where someone left money to the Keswick home, but only if it were used exclusively for white people in the home.
Exactly, and Judge Kaplan in the court below said that under traditional testamentary law, since that couldn't happen, then Keswick didn't get the money at all, and it went elsewhere. What we say, and what we think the judge below missed, is that the court overlooked statutory provisions such as the Civil Rights Acts passed by Congress over 100 years ago, statutory provisions.
These are Reconstruction era civil rights laws.
Yes, known by lawyers and civil rights folks as sections 1981, 1982. of Title 28, and also fair housing laws, Maryland's fair housing laws, federal fair housing laws, which in our view directly apply here. And the issue before the Maryland Court of Appeals, if it considers the Public Justice Center's point of view on this, and we filed an amicus brief, the issue before them will be, in addition to all of the other testamentary questions that are before them, whether or not these civil rights laws control. These laws are laws that the Supreme Court, in the Senator Bacon case that you referred to earlier, simply didn't consider. So this is in many ways a case of first impression, and thus a very important one.
You have other cases also pending, a case involving a juvenile, I understand it, who, well, tell me, who's in a kind of a vegetative state, was not allowed to appear in court because it would be prejudicial to the other side in a medical malpractice case. You're arguing that he should have been allowed?
Absolutely. This was a case when Steve was still at Wilmer. He did this case with PJC, and he was basically excluded from the courtroom because he was declared too prejudicial for the jury. And we argue that there's an absolute constitutional right to attend your trial if you're a party, unless you've waived that right or unless you're causing some sort of disruption.
And that's a decision that's pending now? There's been the oral argument and it's pending?
That is pending,
And
yes.
you have a case involving prisoners with disabilities?
Yes, that case has actually been dismissed now, but that was our first case in the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the state of Maryland was essentially attacking Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act as unconstitutional. And we filed an amicus brief on behalf of 25 disability and civil rights organizations, basically arguing that this is a very important civil rights law and showing why this was a valid exercise of congressional power.
Let's get back to, Steve, your past a little bit and the consistency between what you're doing now and what you did in the past, because I ran across a very interesting quotation from you when you were running for governor. At least this was attributed to you in the Washington Post. You deny it all, right. This was 1986. You ran the Democratic primary against William Donald Schaefer,
yes.
who was then the mayor of Baltimore.
Yes.
It wasn't a very successful run for you, but it did lead you to Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering and some riches thereafter. You said it during that campaign, at least the Washington Post said, "The challenge of democracy in a capitalistic society is to curb the excesses of the jungle, to tame the savagery of unfettered competition, and to make sure the vulnerable do not suffer." Would you...
That's very... do that again. That's lovely.
Well, we actually had a screen up of it. You like that?
I shouldn't be
proud
facetious.
of that? Yeah.
I shouldn't be facetious. I believe every syllable of that.
Yeah.
I believed it then. I believe it now. And I'm glad you found it, because it is precisely that credo that PJC believes and executes. And one of the things, in addition to the fact that they're very good lawyers, that led me to come with them and to work with them on these causes. I mean, the rule of law, well, there are lots of ways of saying this, but the rule of law is only as strong as the protection it gives to the weak. That's what PJC is all about, and it's what I like to think animated my years as a public lawyer. And to the extent possible, influenced a great deal of what I and the firm tried to do at Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering.
You're going to be taking on, how many cases can this project handle at once? How many lawyers do you have associated with the project?
Well, you're basically looking at the staff, right? The two of us. But the goal is to recruit other major law firms like Wilmer, Cutler, for example, law firms in Baltimore and throughout the state, to really try to farm out these briefs. Law firms like doing pro bono work at appellate levels because there's a definite time frame, they're very interested in the issues, and so the project over time will be able, when we create these relationships.
Telephone number, how do people get in touch with you?
The telephone number is 410-625-9409.
Well, many thanks to Deborah Eisenberg and Steve Sachs of the Public Justice Center's Appellate Advocacy Project for joining us in the coffee house, and best of luck to you. Still to come, your genes and your body weight, fiddler and guitar picker Bruce Molsky, an off-season visit to Assateague and Chincoteague, and Graceful Simplicity author Jerome Siegel. But first,
It's a busy Saturday morning at City Place Mall in Silver Spring, and just after 10 a.m., the fourth floor is alive with the sound of music.
What are some of the common perceptions about opera?
Leslie Choi is conducting an arts workshop with a group of kids. The goal is to inspire interest in the performing arts and to give these young folks the opportunity to be part of an opera production.
We, as a professional opera troupe, perform interactively with members of a community who are not performers, people with special needs, people without special needs.
Choi, who heads the unidentified Flying Opera Company, wrote and directed the work entitled Perfection, a space opera in one act. She and her company have been on tour since 1995. But opera at a mall? It's because of Art Space, an 1,800 square foot section provided free of charge by mall management. The goal of Art Space is to engage the community through arts-based activities. Sorrel Fisher, a lifelong arts lover, is co-founder of Art Space.
To the need to develop a sense of community in downtown Silver Spring, with all the diverse community, have people feel comfortable with each other, feel they belong, interact with each other, and provide lots of opportunities through the arts for them to do so.
Garrett Curry organized the exhibit for the dozen artists whose works were on display at Art Space. He says it's good for them and it's good for others to observe the process of artistic creation.
To be an artist, they see what the tenacity is, what it takes to sit down and draw someone or sit down and paint a picture and find out that this might not be a finished product when we start, but we're going to change it as we go along. We're going to evolve this piece.
Art Space also gave these young spectators a chance to see how sculptors mold clay. Art Space is supported by public and private funding. The group is now seeking artists to display their works. Volunteers are also needed to staff upcoming events at Art Space. For the Coffee House, I'm Ross Adams.
Hi, and welcome to In Sickness and in Health at the Coffee House. Were you born to be fat? More than 1 in 2 Americans are so heavy their health may be at risk. Many have tried dieting but say it just doesn't work. Is this an excuse for lack of self-control? Maybe not. Scientists have uncovered several genes that may explain why you can't shed those unwanted pounds. It turns out, in fact, that there's a stronger genetic basis for obesity than for all other common diseases, including cancer, heart attack, and mental illness. Here to talk more about why obesity occurs and how we may be able to treat it is Dr. Marc Reitman, Senior Investigator and Section Chief at the National Institutes of Health's Diabetes Branch. Welcome, Dr. Reitman, to the Coffee House.
Thank you very much, Cathy.
More than half of Americans being overweight and threatening their health is very high. You're from the diabetes branch. Is this one of the possible ailments from being overweight?
The risks of obesity are they're medical risks. So diabetes is the strongest risk of obesity. There are other problems such as high blood pressure, hypertension, lipid problems which lead to heart disease and stroke. Those are the main risks. There's some less strong links to certain kinds of cancers that really are not as well tied into obesity.
How do we know if we're overweight? There are some measurements. The body mass index, I believe, is the most widely used one at the moment. We have a chart here that shows where the ranges are and show you how to calculate exactly where your range is. Your BMI, would you mind saying what your one is?
Sure. The body mass index is your weight divided by your height squared. Mm-hmm. It's calculated in metric units, so it would be your weight in kilos divided by your height in meters. In English units, I weigh a little under 170 pounds. I'm just a little over 5 feet 9 inches, and that gives me a BMI of about 25, which is the borderline between being normal and being overweight. Mm-hmm. So normal is a typical normal range would be 20 to 25, whereas 25 to 30 is mm-hmm. overweight, and 30 and greater is obese.
And this doesn't make allowances, though, if you're young or old. It's just a very rough guide. If you have heavy bones or light bones, male, female, it's just a rough estimate.
This is just a way of expressing in units that anybody can use. For example, Mark McGuire has a BMI something like 30, and that's muscle, that's not fat. So the BMI clearly has problems in certain people, but it's a good guideline to start with.
Some people can't lose weight permanently. They've tried dieting, exercising, really being very tough on themselves, and others resort to surgery to shrink the size of their stomach as the only way to try and get that weight down. 100 years ago, we didn't have very overweight people to the same degree as now, and yet there has always been, I suppose, a family link. Some families have always had overweight people. What is the mix between environment and genes?
I think that there's a very strong contribution from both. You can argue that obesity is a genetic disease because it has the strongest genetic composition of any of the common diseases. On the other hand, you can argue that it's environmental because we haven't changed our genetic composition in the last 100 years. So what are the genes that do that? Obesity is polygenic, meaning many genes contribute, except there are rare exceptions where a single gene can cause obesity in a person.
This is all very cutting edge, isn't it? It's fairly recently that they've been able to say, aha, yes, it is genes, even though people may have guessed this to some degree. How recent?
It's very recent. The genetic background to obesity has really been rigorously studied only in the 1990s and since, and the first single gene cause of obesity were only identified in 1994 and in people in about 1995, 1996.
So what are some of the genes? First of all, I guess I should get from you the explanation for why your expertise in obesity is actually in mice.
Personally, I'm a physician, but I'm a researcher, and it's much easier to study a mouse model of obesity. The beauty of the mice is that all of the genes that have identified for obesity have been first identified in mice, and therefore gives a lot of confidence that by studying mice we're going to figure out what happens in humans. The nitty-gritty details are bound to be different, but the basic physiology of how the body senses and regulates weight is probably going to be the same.
So what have you found from the mice genes or collection of genes? Any single genes that you can say, aha, that's an obese
Sure.
gene?
The most striking discovery was in 1994 of the hormone called leptin, which is a protein made by fat that tells the rest of the body how much fat the body has. And that's used to regulate weight, that's used to regulate food intake, that's used to regulate activity. It's a very central hormone. And there are mice that are missing the leptin. And there are also, I think, about 5 people in the world who've been identified who also are missing the leptin. And these are children who might weigh 100 pounds at age 3, 200 pounds at age 5. Kids who've had to have cosmetic, well, not cosmetic, kids who've had to have the fat taken off the inside of their legs so they could physically walk.
Goodness. That's a single gene instance then. What about collections? That's perhaps much harder to link them all together and say these together make a person prone to being obese.
And yet that's where the vast majority of obesity is today, we believe. There are studies in humans trying to map the genetic cause of obesity in this polygenic obesity. And there are 3, 4, 5 studies now that, since about 1998, and they have identified a number of places in the genome, on the chromosomes, where we think there are genes that predispose to obesity. However, none of these genes have yet been identified to know exactly what their function is, what the gene is and what its function is.
What about studies of twins? What have these shown? Perhaps you can talk about a few of these.
Yeah, the twin studies, the most interesting ones are from Scandinavia, where identical twins have actually been reared in separate families and then studied later in life. And from those sorts of studies, the estimate has been made that about 80% of the propensity towards obesity is genetic. That's probably an overestimate. Other estimates are closer to 40% of the contribution is genetic, but it's fairly large.
Yeah, I'd say. What about someone who's overweight and just not obese yet, but just can't shed those pounds? They've tried dieting, and they're not at a point where they go in for surgery, but could there be a genetic basis behind that as well for them?
Sure. I really think that the reason I'm not a very active person, I think the reason I'm not much heavier than I am is that I probably don't have the genes that predispose to obesity. Whether that's true or not, we don't know.
You have to test yourself one of these days.
But clearly we think it's a continuum. The same genes causing overweight would lead to obesity. We don't know what the environmental causes of obesity are. We assume that it's a lack of exercise. We assume that it's a very easy lifestyle where we have electricity and cars and don't walk a whole lot on average. We assume that it's having such a wonderful assortment of foods, a very high energy and a lot of variety. You can make an animal obese just by taking it off its usual pellet chow and giving it different food every day. It will eat a lot more and become obese. Which is it's called the cafeteria diet, and it's what we eat every day.
And so you're seeing this in your mice. When they're happy and eating everything varied all the time, they will grow heavy, many of them, but not others.
Right.
There was a lot of talk a few years ago about fat cells, fat babies, perhaps leading to heavier adults. Is there any genetic reason that's overridden by this, perhaps a parent overfeeding a young baby, or that hasn't been proved?
I think the data in humans is really not there. In animals, it's very clear that you can develop more fat cells even as you age. So if you keep eating more and more food, or keep giving an animal, mouse or a rat more and more food, it will develop more and more fat cells. On the other hand, I don't think we should use this as a way of saying, well, we shouldn't worry how much kids eat, because it's very important that that good habits form, that kids don't eat too much and they exercise more. That would be very useful things. Unfortunately, there aren't good studies to prove this yet, but I think common sense dictates that the less you eat and the more you exercise, the better it will be for you, and those habits being ingrained would be good.
These fat cells build up and then you can't get rid of them. Was that the part of the theory? So once you have them, they'll always want to be filled up.
That's the theory.
Yeah, never proven.
Yeah, that's
What is going to come of the cutting-edge genetic research that's going on with the link and obesity? How can we treat or perhaps even prevent someone if they know that they were born with a particular set of genes that could predispose them to overweight? What can they do initially? What kind of treatments do you see being invented?
Well, the standard treatments now we have for obesity are diet and exercise and behavior modification, so you keep dieting and keep exercising. And unfortunately, that's successful. Everybody can lose weight initially, but in terms of, say, 5-year success, people talk about, say, a 1 in 20 success rate. It's very, very poor. So, short of a radical thought like, giving people less food, which is just not going to happen in our society, I think one of the likely things down the road will be permanent long-term drug therapy. We do not yet have any of those drugs. We're just sort of in the early stages of that, and clearly any drug you're giving to basically a reasonably healthy population is going to have to be incredibly safe.
How near are we to that? Would you say, just a wild guess? I know you can never tell with these things, but 10 or?
Well, there are already some first-generation drugs for obesity on the market. There's one that was withdrawn, dexvenfluramine, which one would have thought would have been a great drug, but clearly was great for many people, but horrible for others. There is a drug called sibutramine. There's orlistat. There are a number of drugs on the market now, but these are sort of first-generation, not ideal drugs. There's a lot of improvement that could occur in them.
Okay, well, there's hope then. Once you've identified it, there will be many more treatments and prevention methods on the market. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. A very big thank you to Dr. Marc Reitman of the National Institutes of Health for joining me in the coffee house. I'm Cathy Kristiansen, and this has been In Sickness and in Health.
Those lazy, hazy, crazy days of summer. The beach. A summer vacation tradition. Sun, sand, and surf. But to Park Ranger Tracy Ammerman, spring is the best time to head to the shore. There are no crowds, just vast, pristine beaches.
Another big draw to the area in the off-season, the winter and the spring, is the wildlife. The birding is phenomenal here in the winter. The waterfowl, the shorebirds, and so on. It's just spectacular. And the wildlife that's here year-round. is a little bit more relaxed themselves and easier to view than what you'd see in more of the hectic summer season. So it's a really fantastic time to come and enjoy the wildlife.
And, says Ammerman, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump.
It's an easy drive from a very large metropolitan area. The D.C. area, the Baltimore area, the Annapolis area, Philadelphia even. It's a very easy drive, and people who want to get away, especially in the spring, you start to get a little bit of cabin fever, and you want to go out and enjoy the beautiful outdoors. And so here's an easy 2.5, 3 hour drive that you can get away for the weekend.
Okay, the ocean's too chilly for swimming and body surfing, but that doesn't mean you can't go in the water.
With a kayak or a canoe, especially a sea kayak, which doesn't turn over like most people think of a whitewater kayak, you can get right in with wildlife.
Jay Cherrick says, with a sea kayak, you get up close without disturbing the wildlife or polluting the environment, and you get some vigorous exercise to boot. Cherrick's Tidewater Expedition specializes in ecotourism. It offers guided tours at sunrise and sunset. Cherrick's mostly conducts dolphin tours in the off-season. During summer, he says, the bay gets too busy. Cherrick's provides beginner to advanced lessons in kayaking for all ages. Our videographer, Kimberly, couldn't resist trying it out on her own.
Feels great. Feels freeing.
Where to stay? Forget about Assateague Island. It's been spared commercial development. On Chincoteague, there's the Island Motor Inn with mid to high-end waterfront accommodations. And for easy access to the refuge itself, there's the excellent Refuge Motor Inn next to the Assateague Island Wildlife Sanctuary. You won't go hungry. Check out the Island Family Restaurant for outstanding fresh seafood and home-style cooking. And for fanciers of haute cuisine and an extensive wine list, there's also AJ's on the Creek. A warning. Night owls may find the off-season off-putting. Family entertainment like putt-putt is shut down. As for a club scene, well, AJ's on the Creek is about it. If you go for live, folky-type music, don't expect to kick up your heels. Speaking of kicking, how about an evening of 300-pound men in leotards? Chincoteague and Assateague. Spectacular nature, an escape from the concrete jungle, and it's even better in spring. For the Weekend Traveler with Steve Olson, I'm Chuck Barber.
Down this road, but I learned my lesson from the Cotton Eye Joe. Where it come from, where it go, where did it come from? Cotton Eye Joe. Wanna go to meeting, but it didn't get go. Had to stay home with Cotton Eye Joe. Where'd you come from? Where'd you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Where'd you come from? Where'd you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Where'd you come from? Where'd you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe?
Cotton Eye Joe.
Well, I guess we won't ask what the name of that one was.
Cotton Eye Joe.
Well, Bruce, I'd like to welcome you to the musical tradition segment of the Coffee House.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for coming.
Nice to be here.
Yep. Boy, if we asked for the history of that tune, what would...
oh, my gosh.
There's a ton of different...
There's a lot of different ways to play it. That tune has made its way all the way around this country, and it probably came from some other country before it got here.
It can be a blues tune.
It could be a blues tune. It was played by the great Bob Wills back in his early days.
Western swing.
It was a Western swing tune, and played in all different keys. And
it's a standard, though.
It's a standard.
If you're going to play fiddle, you need to...
you got to play Cotton Eye Joe.
Yeah. I wanted to talk about this CD a bit. This is, I guess, your first solo CD?
Yes.
Called Lost Boy?
Yes.
Did your mom name that?
No, my mother did not name this. See, that actually Lost Boy is the name of a fiddle tune.
Well, I knew that.
But you know,
yes.
Seemed appropriate.
This is out on Rounder Records.
Yes.
And essentially you made a decision about, what, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago to sort of say, I'm going to take a break from a fairly lucrative engineering job and say, I'm going to strike out and see if I can...
First of all, that job was lucrative depending on who you talk to.
Well, okay.
But I did. It's been 3 years now, and I've been playing music all my life, and I love the community, and just one thing led to another, and all of a sudden I had 2 full-time jobs, and I had to just follow my heart.
I remember. I didn't realize it had been 3 years, but I remember you telling me, "Oh, I'm going to see if this works."
It's working.
You said, "I'm going to take a year and see what it comes out like." So here we are, 3 years later. It worked.
Yeah, it's great. I've gotten to go to a lot of places. Really had a good time.
Well, I know you have a guitar there, so you must be thinking of playing a guitar tune.
Well, I was thinking about it.
Another old-time tune?
Well, kind of. One of the things that makes our traditional American music sound the way it does is the West African influence on it. Came over here with the banjo and with African culture. And I'll play an African tune that actually is from Zaire, from the great player Wenda Jean Bosco. He recorded it in 1950. And
so you could say then, my classic line, we're going from grits to griot? Sort of. I'll take the fiddle, you play the tune.
I'm not sure I want you to touch it anymore. Here.
Okay.
Tear it up.
All right, there we go. Well, take it away, Bruce.
The title of this tune really describes the way it sounds to me. And Wenda Jean Bosco called this Masanga. And from the Zairean language, that translates to Song of Praise.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. Less is more, said Mies van der Rohe. Yet in our consumer culture, we act like the opposite is true. In our quest for the American dream, many of us are coming up short, even as we own more things, make more money, and climb the corporate ladder to greater success. Less is less, we seem to say, even as our accumulation of more has little meaning. In his book, Graceful Simplicity, Toward a Philosophy and Politics of Simple Living, Jerome Siegel argues that Americans must change this dynamic and reclaim a way of life that is fulfilling and meaningful. Jerome Siegel is also the author of Agency and Alienation, A Theory of Human Presence, and Creating the Palestinian State, A Strategy for Peace. He lives in Silver Spring. Welcome to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on. You talk about the American dream in this book, and you also talk about an alternative dream. Could you explain what both of those things are?
Right. Well, I think that the standard American dream we sort of know pretty well. That's the dream of making it in conventional terms, whether it's career and money and having more than the next guy. The alternative American dream is not just something that individuals have, but I think something that has animated American life and American history really from the beginning. And it goes back even further. It really has to do with two visions really of the place of money in the good life, and two visions really of even the place of the economic realm. And the alternative dream is really much more diverse, because what it really says is that getting and spending isn't what the good life is about, and that the place of the economic is really to give people kind of a platform that allows them to meet their basic needs, and then allows them to turn away from the economic dimension of life to find the good life somewhere else. And that somewhere else is where there's tremendous diversity. So in the early days, it might have meant religion. For some people, it meant political activity. For some people, that meant radical political activity. For people like Jefferson and Adams, it meant sort of a democratic engagement, but they were concerned really about people being directed towards the public well-being and devoting their life towards that.
And quality of life.
Right. And for others, it's meant nature. For Thoreau, it's been something different. An expansion of leisure. For others, art and literature and poetry and so on. So people have found the good life in many different things. The only thing that holds simple living together is that it's not a matter of spending very little for its own sake. It's really keeping the economic dimension to a limited scope, so that in fact one could find richness in some other dimensions of life, of which there's been tremendous variation.
And what's been happening, though, also in that is the American dream, the old American dream, in terms of consumerism, is away from this meaning in life, this quality of life. Yes,
that's right. And it's not just consumerism. It's also a sort of a pursuit of status involving one's job and a pace of life. So that I talk about gracefulness as kind of the alternative concept that I want to put forward. And it's a diverse concept. Some of it has to do with beauty, an aesthetic dimension, but also an aesthetic of time.
Well, time is the big word, it seems to me.
That's right. And talking about wanting to be able to go through life both more slowly, to have slow food rather than fast food, to have a certain kind of rhythm in one's life. And there are ancient traditions, whether it was the first labor legislation, which was the Sabbath 3,000 years ago, or the fact that and it is this amazing thing how 3,000 years ago people were able to find one day of rest. Today, 3,000 years later, with this gigantic economy and so on, people can't even find one day.
Yeah, you talk about using the Sabbath as an ideal in terms of every day.
I think I think for a lot of people it's kind of a point of entree, because whether you're religious or not, there's sort of enough of an echo of doing something different, whether on it's Friday night or Sunday and so on, that gives people an opportunity to sort of slow down. And of course, and if you have children, and that's in my own life, that's in many ways is when these things got a little bit more serious, as they sort of start to think about how are you going to find some space for doing something more slowly and for doing something that's more meaningful. Now, part of the book is really about the politics of this, because what I argue, unlike a lot of people in the simple living movement is that making this kind of thing work is not just a matter of getting your head screwed on right and individual resolve and so on, that the society can either stack the cards against you, or it can facilitate simple living.
Right.
And I argue that our society makes it very difficult to, and a lot of that goes back to the issue of money. So that a lot of other people who've written about simple living, for instance, have used kind of a medical analogy and have talked about affluenza as kind of a disease of sort of overconsumption or luxury fever or wealth addiction and so on. And these are also these disease analogies and the sort of this lesson of individual consciousness. And I argue that, in fact, the reason that most people in the middle of our society feel that they need the money that they have and they need to work the hours that they work is that, in fact, it's very expensive in our society to meet very ordinary needs. And we lose touch of that when we just look at the numbers the way they're crunched by economists. But if you look, for instance, at housing as an example, economists will talk about the square footage, or they'll talk about the amenities that are in the house and so on over time and how that's changed in the 20th century. But you look at ordinary people and what they want from a house, and basically they want decent housing, but they want a safe neighborhood, not too far from work, with access to good public schools. And those are not, strange desires.
Right. They're very
not,
reasonable.
it's not an escalator of consumption. But you ask, like where we live, in the Washington, D.C. area, sort of where do you have to live to have neighborhoods that are safe enough to say to your kid, if you've got a preteen child, go out and play. So you're not the chauffeur, you're not always babysitting and so on. Our parents said, go out and play to us, right? I don't say go out and play. To my 9-year-old, you probably don't say it to your kid either, right? Yeah, there probably are some neighborhoods around it, like maybe Somerset is like that, and they're definitely good schools, good public schools.
Right.
$350,000 to live there, right?
True.
So who has access to that?
You talk about need becoming desire too in a place of just.
Well, there's one point in which I talk about sort of underlying needs that everybody has, and a structure that the society has, whereby those underlying needs are converted contextually into desires for specific kinds of commodities. And for instance, it's like people have a need for a sense of identity, a need for self-fulfillment, and so on, a need for friendship.
Right.
And those needs can be met either more or less directly.
Right.
And what a market economy very often does is it finds indirect symbolic ways of satisfying those needs through money. And as a second best alternative, the mistake a lot of people make is thinking that money doesn't matter. It does matter, and it's a very good thing to fall back on, but it's very costly what you have to do in order to get money. And very often what you have to do in order to get money is to devote your life to it. In other words, to work more than you need to work.
Right.
And it's one of the things that we've abandoned in this society and as a social issue, which is the expansion of leisure. For 100 years, part of how we measured growth in the United States from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century was by reducing the work week and the work day from a 12-hour day down to an 8-hour day.
Right.
In the 1930s, we had legislation that would have created a 6-hour day and a 30-hour week that passed the Senate and didn't get to the House floor. And that was the last time it was a major national issue. And instead what's happened on the family level is that women now have entered the formal workplace as the basic model, and the family is putting as many hours into the formal workplace as we did back in the middle of the 19th century.
Wow.
And people are racing, and the demands now as a parent, because of the safety issues, you're a chauffeur, you're a manager, and so on. And so everyone's driving themselves crazy. And the term gracefulness is kind of my term for sort of what it is that you discover is missing. That there's no gracefulness in our lives whatsoever.
Right.
And I think that the United States is ready for almost sort of like a big turn of the dial, almost like a turn of a kaleidoscope in which all the pieces will look differently if we answer like one question differently, which is and the basic question is, what is an economy for? And it's a question we never ask, that implicitly we've got an answer, which is the economy is supposed to be for more and more. And we measure its success by, is it giving us more and more? Is it growing more and more? And if we answer it differently, such as that, well, the economy is just to meet our needs including needs for security, and then the good life is to walk away from it.
Yeah.
And all sorts of issues, public policy issues, schooling issues,
Yes.
Issues of of what we mean by poverty, what we mean by richness, and so all those will look different.
Right. We only have a couple minutes, and I just wanted you to also mention the very start of your book. You tell a story about your father going to work and how he he changes clothes. Please.
Oh yeah. Well, this is something that took me years to understand. But my father would get up every morning, and he would take a white shirt that was starched in the Chinese laundry, a fresh white shirt, a new fresh tie, and a very fine suit, and shiny shoes, and he would go off to work, and he would come home hours and hours later in the same outfit. And it took me years to realize that he would go on the subway in those clothes, and he would get to work, and he'd go to his locker, and he'd take it all off, and he would change into his work clothes, and he worked in a factory in Brooklyn. We lived in the Bronx, and he traveled an hour and a half to do this. And it was just, it was a view that a personal view really, about how you had to appear to be in public with pride.
Right. It's so interesting how you open the book with that, in terms of you're talking about work and time and money, but it's also image and society that you're dealing with, the other people in the world that you're going to work with, and the expectations that you have of yourselves and that they have of you. So it's quite well done, and we're down to 30 seconds. So I'm just letting you know that it's just a lovely way that you introduce the book. And
thank you.
It's so sort of intrinsic in what we're doing.
Well, we struggle with these issues, and we still do.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Thanks to Jerome Siegel for joining me in the coffee house. Again, his new book is Graceful Simplicity, Toward a Philosophy and Politics of Simple Living. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
That's it for the April edition. See you next month in the Coffee House.
Test, not just of strength, but of the power of the mind. And if you complete the journey, you will be changed forever. The few, the proud, the Marines.
Have you noticed that no matter how careful you are at saving money, somehow it always seems to get away? Is it part of a larger conspiracy? Or is it that you aren't putting your money in a safe, secure place? Perhaps you should be buying new U.S. savings bonds. For as little as $25, you could be earning competitive rates. And what could be safer? You can even get them indexed to inflation. And with the new Easy Saver plan, you can purchase new U.S. savings bonds automatically from your checking or savings account. You choose how much and how often before they get to it. The new Easy Saver plan for U.S. savings bonds from the U.S. Treasury. Keeping your money just got easier.
Take it from the Arbor Day Foundation. Rainforests are special. They're beautiful, wonderful, and if you look closely, you'll even say they're magical. Remarkable plants grow here, and the magic is that some can cure diseases. Half of our planet's plants and animals make their home in the rainforest. And some of the birds that nest here fly every summer to our own neighborhoods. But as beautiful, as wonderful, as magical, as important as the rainforests are, they're being burned and bulldozed, battered and abused by people who just don't know what they're destroying. What's left is a barren, sick land. We can help save the rainforest. Through the National Arbor Day Foundation's Rainforest Rescue, we can stop the fires and save the land. Support Rainforest Rescue. Write the Arbor Day Foundation.